The little town of Greyford was as of now winding down for the evening when the transport rolled in from the highway. It was one of those ancient diesel coaches with blurred paint and windows clouded from a long time of tidy and fingerprints. Motor gave a tired moan as it came to a stop at the edge of Primary Road, right next to the warped lamppost that flashed more frequently than it shone. Most days, the entry of the evening transport went unnoticed. A modest bunch of travelers might step off farmhands returning from the city, a traveling sales representative with a bag of cheap trinkets, or the intermittent college understudy coming domestic for the holidays. But that night was different. A man ventured down from the transport limit. Stairs. His developments were unhurried and deliberate. He was tall and incline in a way that made him seem nearly delicate, in spite of the fact that there was something in his pose that recommended otherwise. His coat was as well overwhelming for the season. A profound charcoal fleece that brushed against his boots with each step. The evening discuss was warm with a kind of muggy stillness that clung to the skin, but he did not appear bothered. His cap was pulled sufficient to shadow his face, all that may be seen was the swoon diagram of a sharp jaw and pale skin beneath, yet there was no mixing up the eyes. Those who looked at him swore they felt them sometime recently. They saw them dark, unfaltering, and unblinking. No one in Greyford recognized him, yet each individual who caught locate of him felt a interesting drag at the back of their mind, a prickling, a glint of memory they may not very place, as in spite of the fact that they had seen him once in a dream, they had long since forgotten the transport driver gave a neighborly gesture as the man ventured absent from the curb, evening he advertised out of habit. The stranger said nothing. He returned the gesture, moderate and nearly considerate sometime, recently altering the strap of the battered calfskin travel bag that hung at his side. Main Road was calm at that hour. The basic needs store had, as of now, closed, its sign turned inward. Across the road, the equipment store proprietor was locking the door. The cafe windows gleamed delicately, but the chairs were as of now upturned on the tables. Greyford was not a put of flurry or noise. It was the kind of town where life happened in whispers, where privileged insights clung to the ancient brick buildings like ivy. Most night times passed, without incident. That was why the locate of a stranger strolling down Fundamental Road without talking or looking around or inquiring where anything was felt wrong. Mrs. Linton, the landlord, had been observing from her porch. Her boarding house was a pale listing structure that inclined somewhat to the left, the paint peeled like sunburnt skin. She had been anticipating no one, yet when the man ceased at her entryway, she knew right away he would be remaining there. He did not knock. He essentially looked up at her with those unusual eyes, and in a voice mow and calm said, "Good evening, Lily." The title hit her like a slapped lily. No one had called her that in 30 years, not since she was 17, not since he. She caught herself and gulped hard. "Do I?" "No," a swoon grin twisted at the corner of his mouth in spite of the fact that it never come to his eyes. "You utilized to," he said simply. She faltered at that point, ventured aside, motioning toward the door. "Rooms are upstairs. We have 2 available." The stranger strolled past her without another word. He did not inquire the price. He did not ask a key. He basically climbed the squeaking staircase, as in spite of the fact that he had strolled it 100 times before. From her patio, Mrs. Linton observed him vanish into the shadows of the upper hallway. A snugness settled in her chest. She did not like the way the discuss felt after he passed, as in spite of the fact that it had developed heavier, down the road a few other sets of eyes had observed the exchange. Old man Rourke, who lived over the barber shop, murmured to himself as he lit his pipe. He did not like newcomers. No great comes from people who appear up unannounced. He said to the purge room. Inside the cafe, a youthful server named Emily squeezed her confront to the glass. She seemed not say why, but she felt beyond any doubt the stranger had looked at her. Really looked as if he had seen something more profound than her reflection in the window. Even the mutts appeared unsettled. The mutt that ordinarily, relaxed exterior. The basic needs store gave a moo whimper and lurked absent when the stranger passed. Night came rapidly in Greyford. The skyline turned the color of burnt copper, and the street lamps flashed on one by one. Somewhere in the remove, a prepare. Horn moaned long and mournful. Upstairs at the boarding house, the stranger unloaded his travel bag with systematic care. Inside were, as it were, a few items: a worn calfskin notepad with frayed edges, a wellspring right cleaned, but old a collapsed photo, with twisted edges. A little discolored stash observed that ticked as well, quick as in spite of the fact that its pulse was out of match up with the world. He put the scratch pad on the work area by the window and opened it. The page's interior were filled with names composed in flawless inclined handwriting. Next to each title were brief sentences. Some were simple. "Owes a debt, keeps the cash in the blue jar." Others were darker, "Killed the man in the quarry." June 82. Buried her sister behind. The orchard. The final page had a modern name. Lily Linton underneath was written, still pretending. Downstairs, Mrs. Linton poured herself a glass of bourbon she once in a while touched. Her hands trembled slightly. She seemed not clarify why she felt afraid. As it were knew that when the stranger had talked her ancient title, it had brought with it the scent of rain on rust, the sound of somebody shouting distant absent, and the memory of something. Mrs. Linton, the landlord, swore she had never seen him. Before, she had lived in Greyford her whole life, and there was not a confront. She seemed not place. People came and went in the city, but not here. Here in Greyford, the same families had lived for generations. The same voices resounded down Primary Road. Each morning and each evening, it was a put where outsiders were uncommon and more often than not gone inside a day. She had been sitting in the front parlor of the boarding house. The ancient floorboards squeaked with each move of her chair. The scent of wood clean and swoon, cooking oil waited from dinner. Outside, the sun was sliding behind the slopes, and the street lamp in front of her door was starting to murmur with frail light. She was sewing gradually more out of propensity than need. The press of the needles kept her company, then she listened it. The overwhelming ponder footfalls of boots on the patio steps. The boarding house once in a while saw visitors in summer unless a sales representative missed the final transport or a farmhand required. A bed between jobs, she set her weaving in her lap and held up for the knock. It did not come. Instead, the entryway opened, not discourteously, not with force, just gradually, as in spite of the fact that whoever stood there as of now knew they were welcome. Tall man filled the doorway. He wore a coat as well overwhelming for the climate and a dim, wide cap that shadowed most of his face. He ventured interior without inquiring and closed the entryway behind him with a calm click. Her to begin with thought was that he might be lost. Her moment thought was that she did not need to know why he was not. He looked at her directly. His eyes were dull in a way she seemed not describe. They did not fair meet hers. They appeared to ponder them. She felt as if he were weighing something approximately her, as one might weigh in question in the hand, "Good evening, Lily," he said. The sound of it made her still Lily. No one called her that anymore. No one had called her that in 30 a long time, not since the summer she turned 17. The title had a place to another life, a more youthful life, one that had finished with a sharp conclusion she never talked of. She felt the weight of the room squeezing in. The tick of the corridor clock appeared abruptly as well. Loud how? Do you know that title? She inquired, her voice more tightly than she meant. He tilted his head slightly. You utilized to, he said, and nothing more, used to what she needed to ask. Used to live here. Used to be somebody else. Used to be happy. The words dried in her throat sometime recently. They may form. You are here for a room, she inquired instead. The tone was brisk, the way she talked to traveling business people and men from the rail yard who noticed of press and coal dust. Yes, he said. She stood gradually and crossed to the front work area where the overwhelming calfskin and roll sat. The book was worn from a long time of ink and hands turning its pages. She opened it to the following purge line and picked up her pen. Name, she said, Elias Crowe, he answered. Composed it down in slick, cautious letters. Something approximately the sound of it appeared old. Not obsolete like a title from her grandmother's time, but more seasoned in a diverse way. Like a title pulled from a story whispered over a fire, she did not like it. 2 rooms are open, she told him. One ignores Fundamental Road, and the other faces the back garden main road, he said without hesitation. She come to beneath the counter for the key to room 4. Her fingers brushed the metal tag, and for a minute she felt it was cold as ice. She put it on the counter. There is no breakfast benefit, she said. If you need coffee, there is a pot in the kitchen sometime recently. 8. He gave a single gesture and took the key, as he turned toward the staircase. She'd taken note the calfskin handbag thrown over his shoulder. It was ancient, but not worn in the way travel wears. A bag it looked cared for, maintained like something imperative was interior. His boots were about quiet on the stairs. She tuned in until she might listen them no more. The corridor over was gulped in shadow. Mrs. Linton returned to her chair. She picked up her weaving once more in spite of the fact that her hands did not move. Her intellect kept circling back to the way he had said her name. Not fair, the word, but the tone, as if it was his right to say it, as if he had been holding up to talk it again. She attempted to keep in mind who had final called her Lily, not a friend, not a family member. It had been a man, though, a man with a voice that carried the same moo certainty, but that man was gone. He had been gone for 30 years. Her eyes moved to the divider where the ancient family photo still hung. She looked at the faces. In it, her guardians, her brother, herself. The youthful young lady in the picture had a diverse confront from the lady she had become. She had light in her eyes then. She had no reason to be perplexed of shadows on her doorstep. She told herself it was nothing, a coincidence. Perhaps he had studied the title in an ancient record. Perhaps somebody in town had specified it, but the thought did not sit right. The way he looked at her made it inconceivable to dismiss. She stood and went to the kitchen. The discuss was cooler there. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it as well fast. When she set the glass down, her hand was shaking. Upstairs, the floor gave a swoon moan, as in spite of the fact that somebody was pacing, she envisioned the man in room 4, unloading his satchel, what would be inside clothes books or something else entirely. She attempted to thrust the thought away. There was no sense borrowing trouble, but the unease did not lift. It clung to her shoulders like a soggy shawl. The clock in the passage chimed once. The sound appeared louder than it ought to have been. She thought of locking the front entryway for the night, then recalled she, as of now, had some time. Recently, he arrived. She sat once more in the parlor. The sewing lay in her lap, untouched. Her eyes kept floating toward the staircase. Every squeak and move of the ancient building made her listen, half trusting and half fearing that he might come down again. The night exterior deepened. The lamppost on the road flashed weakly. The boarding house was quiet, but in that calm Mrs. Linton felt watched, not by the street, not by the town, but by the man who presently possessed room 4, and by the title he had talked as if it still had a place to her. Another morning, the stranger sat at the as-it-were cafe in Greyford. The putt was called Mill Operators after the family who had possessed it for 3 generations. It stood on the corner of Fundamental and Willow, where the broken asphalt slanted somewhat toward the ancient railroad line. It was a little putt with worn wooden floors and windows that caught the to-begin-with light of the day. The scent of coffee and new bread floated out into the road and twisted through the discuss like a warm invitation. The stranger had chosen the table in the distant corner, closed the window. From there he seemed see both the entryway and the road outside. He sat with a daily paper open in front of him. The pages were solid and collapsed neatly, yet he did not turn them. His eyes were not on the print, but on the individuals who passed by. The chime over the entryway gave a tired ring as the to begin with client ventured in. It was Mr. Jarvis, the postmaster, a man who had lived in Greyford all his life and knew everyone's title and habits. He gestured courteously toward the stranger as one might gesture to any new face. "Good morning, Harold," the stranger said, without hesitation. Mr. Jarvis halted, mid-step. It was uncommon for somebody unused to know his, to begin with, title let. Alone, utilize it so easily. "Do I know you?" he asked. The stranger grinned faintly and said, "You utilized to keep a letter in your work area for 20 years. The one you never sent." Mr. Jarvis froze, his lips separated, as in spite of the fact that to deny it, but no words came. Instead, he strolled rapidly to the counter and requested his coffee without looking back. The chime rang once more, and in came Mrs. Whitaker, who claimed the Bloom shop. Her hands continuously noticed faintly of lavender, and she carried herself with the brisk vitality of somebody utilized to being active from daybreak to dusk. "Morning, Ellen," the stranger said. She flickered in shock at that point, frowned. "Do I know you, sir?" The stranger's voice was moo and calm when he replied, "The chrysanthemums behind your shop never developed once more after that night in August." Her confront went pale and she clutched her handbag more tightly, sometime recently rushing to a table close the door. One by one the townspeople came in. The stranger welcomed each of them by title. Sometime recently they may present themselves, and each time he included something more, a sentence or two that come to profound into their private lives. Things they had never told a companion or a spouse. Things that had been buried beneath a long time of silence to the youthful server Emily. He said, "Your brother still keeps the cut in the attic." She about dropped the coffee pot she was carrying. Her eyes shot to his, but he had as of now turned back to the newspaper too. "The rancher, Mr. Klein," he said. "The fence on the south field is not the as it were put you buried something." Mr. Klein's hands shook so severely he spilled half his tea sometime recently, taking off without wrapping up it. No one laughed. No one charged him of lying. It was as if each word he talked carried a weight that smashed any thought of doubt. The cafe itself appeared to notice. The murmur of the fridge in the corner sounded louder. The ticking clock over the counter appeared to drag. Even the daylight through the windows felt colder as the minutes passed. Emily attempted to active herself with clearing tables, but her eyes kept floating to the man in the corner. He scarcely moved. His coffee sat untouched, developing cold every so regularly. His fingers tapped once against the tabletop in a moderate, measured rhythm. When no one was entering the cafe, he would look briefly out the window, as in spite of the fact that holding up for somebody specific, at one point Mrs. Whitaker assembled, the boldness to talk to him again. "How do you know these things?" she asked. The stranger looked at her for a long minute and at that point said, "Because I keep in mind what you forget." Her lips trembled at the reply, and she rose without touching her breakfast plate. By mid-morning, the normal chatter of the cafe was gone. No one talked over a whisper. Every match of eyes dodged the man in the corner. He did not appear to mind. If anything, he looked as in spite of the fact that this quiet was precisely what he expected outside. A match of school children squeezed their faces to the window. They snickered at to begin with. But when the stranger looked straightforwardly at them through the glass, they ran without looking back. At 11 o'clock, the chairman himself entered. Mayor Collins was a tall man with a booming voice and the sort of nearness that filled a room. He walked toward the counter with his normal cheer. Then the stranger said one calm sentence. The chairman ceased as if struck. His confront, depleted of color, and his hands fixed at his sides. Without another word, he turned and left. The entryway swung closed behind him with a sharp last sound. Emily found herself grasping the edge of the counter. She had no thought what the stranger had said, but anything it was had turned the most certain man in town into somebody who seemed not remain in the same room as him. When the cafe purged for the lunch break, the stranger at long last collapsed his newspaper. He stood with moderate development, as in spite of the fact that he had been holding up for this minute all morning. Without a look at the counter, he put correct altar on the table. Then he strolled out into the sunlight. Emily went to clear his table. The coffee container was still full and untouched. On the table where the daily paper had been was a single collapsed slip of paper. She opened it with shaking fingers. Inside, in flawless, exact penmanship, were 2 words. "For you." She looked up rapidly toward the street, but the stranger was gone. Leader Collins entered the cafe fair sometime recently. Noon, the chime over the entryway gave its tired ring and each head turned toward him. In Greyford, the leader was not fair a politician. He was the man who shook hands at each wedding, who gave talks at each gather celebration, who stood at the front of the church on holidays. His voice was known to all. It carried over the square like the ring of the ancient church bell. Strong, certain, incomprehensible to ignore. He was dressed in his normal, fresh shirt and custom-fitted vest. The blackout sparkle of his shoes caught the light as he ventured inside. His confront wore the practiced grin that had won him 4 decisions in a row. He waved to the room as if the discuss itself were his audience. Morning. People, he said, with the simple warmth of a man who accepted each eye on him was friendly. The cafe had been calm since the stranger had arrived that morning. Now the discuss appeared to shift. The leader saw the man in the corner and delayed, as it were a minute sometime recently, striding toward the counter. He requested his coffee with cream and a sprint of sugar. Emily arranged it rapidly and set the glass in front of him with both hands to stow away their tremor. She needed to caution him. She needed to tell him to take the coffee and leave, but her voice would not come. The leader took his container and made his way to the stranger's table. Perhaps he implied to welcome the modern arrival. Perhaps he essentially did not like secrets in his town. He ceased close to the table and inclined one hand on the back of the purge chair over from the stranger. "Morning, sir," the leader said. "We have not met before. Name is Collins. I like to know everybody who comes through my town." The stranger looked up slowly. His eyes met the mayor's, and for a minute, not one or the other man spoke. The cafe appeared to hold its breath. Then the stranger signaled to the chair, as in spite of the fact that welcoming the leader to sit Collins brought down himself into it, his back straight, his shoulders squared. He took a taste of coffee, keeping his look settled on the stranger, as in spite of the fact that holding up for him to speak. Instead, the stranger inclined forward slightly, the brim of his cap shadowed his confront, so that, as it were, the pale line of his mouth was visible. When he talked, his voice was low. Only Collins might listen. The words, it was a single sentence, soft, relentless, unbroken. Whatever the words were, they landed like a blow. The mayor's eyes widened. The color depleted from his confront so rapidly, it was as if somebody had drawn it out with a wire. His hold on the coffee container faltered. The container tipped and the dim fluid spilled over the table and onto his lap. He did not respond. To the heat, he basically stood so unexpectedly that his chair slipped back and scratched the floor. Collins gazed at the stranger for a long heartbeat. His mouth opened as if to speak. No sound came. His hand jerked toward the door. Then he turned and cleared out the cafe without another word. The chime over the entryway gave its ring once more, but it sounded level and dull. He did not pay for his coffee. He did not apologize for the spill. He strolled rapidly down the road, his steps uneven as in spite of the fact that the ground itself had ended up shaky underneath him. Inside the cafe, no one moved. Emily stood solidified behind the counter. Mr. Jarvis, the postmaster, gazed at the entryway with his lips squeezed tight. Mrs. Whitaker held her teacup fair underneath her mouth in spite of the fact that she had overlooked to drink. The stranger calmly set the mayor's tipped container upright. He took a serviette and touched absent the spill as if nothing unordinary had happened. Then he returned to his situate and unfurled his newspaper. The pages did not turn. They never did. A shadow passed over the window as Collins rushed by outside. He did not see in. His shoulders were slouched and his look was settled on the ground. He looked like a man strolling, absent from something he might not face. Minutes passed some time recently. Anybody in the cafe talked again, and when they did, their voices were low. What did he say to him? Somebody whispered. No one answered. Only Emily thought she saw the stranger's mouth bend into the faintest recommendation of a grin. Sometime recently, it vanished. By 12, Greyford buzzed with conversation of the puzzling newcomer. Word in a little town, voyages quicker than the wind that runs down its purge streets. A look, from one individual to another, a whispered word. Whereas paying for bread a sentence passed between two men inclining on a fence, it all carried over the contract paths until everybody had listened something, and everybody had included something of their own. The morning had started like any other shutter's opening with a moderate groan, the scent of preparing bread floating from millers, the sound of a tractor thundering in the areas past town. But by late morning, these sounds had gotten to be foundation, commotion to the murmur of conversation. Everywhere you went, individuals were talking of him. The tall man in the overwhelming coat, the one who talked names he ought to not know, the one who said things that made faces turn pale. Some thought he was a Detective Greyford had not seen one in a long time, not since the railroad mischance that still lived in the back of people's minds. A criminologist implied questions, and questions implied trouble. They envisioned him with a notepad full of privileged insights, a man sent by a few higher specialists to burrow through the lives of the town and drag out the parts they wished buried. Others swore he was a con artist, the kind who came with a smooth voice and an intelligent trick. They envisioned he had a way of prying data free and utilizing it to get what he wanted. They pondered if he would be found in the dead of night slipping from one house to another with pockets full of what was not his. A few whispered, darker theories. They did not talk of them openly. They held up until the shop entryway had closed, and the road exterior was empty. They inclined near and dropped their voices low. Some said he was not from here at all. Not indeed from any put. A outline may name. Some said he carried something. With him that gave him his knowing a relic, a curse a bargain. One man claimed he had seen the stranger's shadow move when he himself had not. A boy said his grandma had talked of a man like him in stories told to startle children, stories in which the man did not age and continuously cleared out with one more soul than the town had before. In the basic needs store, Mrs. Calder inquired Mrs. Whitaker if she had talked to him. Mrs. Whitaker shook her head rapidly and imagined to be active with the carrots. In the post office, Mr. Jarvis moved slower than normal and maintained a strategic distance from looking out the window toward the inn. Even the school children taken note. Something distinctive in the air. Their giggling felt thinner. Their recreations. In the dusty parcel finished sooner than usual at the equipment store, Mr. Klein told anybody who would tune in that he did not believe men who carried no devices and wore boots with no mud. He did not specify that the stranger had as of now talked to him that morning. He did not specify the words that had been said approximately the south field, but his hands would not halt trembling when he numbered altar for customers by the counter of the cafe. Emily listened, two men talking in moo voices around the mayor's sudden takeoff earlier. They may not get it. Why Collins had cleared out so quickly. He was a man who adored to talk. Yet he had strolled absent without a word. One of the men said it must have been something bad. The other, basically, shook his head and said nothing. Even the discuss in Greyford appeared to listen. The winged creatures roosted on phone wires sat still as in spite of the fact that the warmth of the day had squeezed them into silence. The clean that floated down Primary road twirled gradually in sluggish circles, as if time itself had developed cautious. Inside the hotel, Mrs. Linton kept to herself. She moved through the rooms with calm steps. She did not see toward the stairs driving to room 4 in her intellect. She kept replaying the sound of her ancient title on his lips. The more she thought of it, the less it felt like coincidence. It was not a guess. It was not a fortunate memory from somebody else. It was talked with the certainty of a man naming something he owned down. At the distant conclusion of the road, ancient man, Rourke sat in the shade of the barbershop overhang, smoking his pipe. When inquired, almost the stranger, he as it were grunted, but when the sun plunged behind the clouds, his eyes taken, after the upper windows of the hotel and did not move away. By early evening, the rumors had taken root so profound they no longer required the truth. The stranger had gotten to be anything individuals most feared, a shadow in their possessed story, a figure, who seemed be anything since no one challenged to inquire him directly, and through it all he was no place to be seen. No one had spotted him since he cleared out the cafe. It was as if he had ventured off Fundamental Road and broken up into the air, but each so frequently somebody would swear they felt him near. The sensation was continuously the same, a prickle at the back of the neck, a sudden drop in the heat, the certainty that if they turned rapidly sufficient, they would see a man in a dull coat, observing them from fair past the edge of the crowd. By 12, Greyford buzzed with his title in spite of the fact that no one had inquired for it. They talked of him without talking it aloud, and still the questions developed. Martha, the bread cook, was not the kind of lady to tremble easily. She had worked through 30 a long time of hot broilers and long mornings. She had carried sacks of flour, heavier than a few men in the town. Her hands were solid. Her back was straight. Her voice may cut through the clatter of the advertise with ease. But on that day, her steps into the cafe were insecure, as in spite of the fact that the exceptionally floorboards underneath her were uncertain whether to hold her up, the stranger sat in his normal place. The corner table closed the window where the light fell in a way that appeared to dodge his face. In front of him, the same container of coffee sat untouched. Beside it, the same daily paper lay open to the same page it had appeared. That morning, he looked as in spite of the fact that he had not moved in hours, and however there was no tidy on his coat, no sign that time had challenged to settle on him. Martha stopped at the threshold. The cafe entryway swung closed behind her. With a quieted creak, the few benefactors show kept their eyes imagining to studied or mix their drinks. However, each one of them was mindful of her approach. She strolled forward gradually, her fingers fixing around the edge of her apron. Her lips moved soundlessly, as in spite of the fact that practicing words she seemed not, however, bring herself to speak. When she come to his table, she did not sit. She stood there, moving her weight from one foot to the other. The stranger looked up at her with a calm expression that some way or another felt like he had been holding up for her all along. There was no shock in his eyes, as it were a kind of persistent inevitability. He said something discreetly, and anything, it was appeared to drag the discussion. From her lungs, her shoulders drew in, her head lowered. The muscles in her jaw fixed as if to hold back anything debilitated to spill from her. She replied him in a voice no one else might listen, in spite of the fact that each ear strained to capture the sound. The discussion kept going no more than 2 minutes. During that time, the cafe developed unnaturally still. The ticking clock over the counter appeared louder. The blackout murmur of the coffee machine filled the quiet between their words, like the sound of far-off rain. Then it was over. Martha turned absent from him and cleared out without looking at anyone. Her confront was pale, her eyes shinning with a luster of tears she did not wipe away. The entryway swung closed once more with that same moderate creak, and those closest to it swore they listened her murmuring as she crossed the street, "I will settle it. I will make it right." The words were more guarantee than prayer. She rehashed them once more and once more, as in spite of the fact that talking them would tie her to them. Those who saw her pass from sea felt a weight settle in their chests. No one knew what the stranger had told her. No one challenged to inquire her afterward, but they taken note, little changes in the days that followed. The pastry shop closed early without explanation. The cheerful enhancements in its windows were taken down. Martha's once warm welcoming to clients got to be a quiet nod. Some evenings a dim light may be seen burning in the back of the shop until the early hours of the morning, and once somebody claimed they listened her talking to somebody, in spite of the fact that when they looked through the entryway, she was alone. In Greyford, the littlest of changes got to be the biggest, of warnings, and presently individuals strolled past the pastry kitchen, a small faster. They talked in lower voices when the stranger's title came up. It was not fair that he knew things. It was that anything he said was sufficient to send a lady like Martha out into the daylight, trembling and mumbling like she carried the weight of the entire town on her back, and someplace in the calm spaces between the dividers and the streets, Greyford started to ponder who would be another. That evening, the sun sank behind the edge, casting long shadows over Greyford. The disgust was overwhelming with the scent of wood smoke and moist earth. One by one, the townsfolk made their way toward the ancient assembly corridor at the conclusion of Fundamental Street. It had been built eras prior, and its timbers were dim with age and oil. The same lobby had seen moves wedding gatherings, warm talks about almost cultivate charges, and the uncommon but fundamental get-togethers when the entire town required to confront something together. They came in twos and threes, talking in moo voices, looking over their shoulders, as in spite of the fact that they were, as of now, perplexed of being overheard. There was no official declaration, no posted take note. However, word had spread, as it continuously did in Greyford, carried from patio to yard and whispered at the showcase stalls. Something had to be done around the man in the cafe. The man who knew as well much. Inside the corridor, the discuss was hotter, but close. The light came from a dozen hanging lights, each one influencing somewhat on its chain, as if uneasy folding chairs had been set out in slick lines confronting the little wooden organize, where the chairman more often than not stood to speak. People found their seats and clutched their coats in their laps. The rub of metal legs against the worn floorboards reverberated in the tall-ceilinged space. They held up for the mayor. They held up for somebody to begin. But at that point, the mumbling voices faltered. A swell of quiet moved from the back of the lobby toward the front, like the shadow of a passing cloud. Heads turned, hands stilled, breaths caught. The stranger was there. He sat in the exceptionally front push, specifically in the center situate, as if it had a place to him. His pose was loose. His coat hung flawlessly over the back of the chair, his cap resting in his lap. He was looking straight ahead, but not at the stage. His look was settled on something distant past the dividers of the corridor, something, as it were, he may see. And in spite of the fact that he did not move, his mouth carried the faintest proposal of a smile. No one had seen him enter. No one had listened the door. It was as in spite of the fact that he had been sitting there, from the exceptionally starting holding up for them to arrive. The space around him felt distinctive by one means or another, not colder, not hotter. Fair changed in a way that made the hairs at the back of the neck stand on end. The individuals in, the seats closest to him, moved uneasily. Some calculated their chairs marginally away. Others collapsed their arms firmly over their chests, as if to hold in anything privileged insights they dreaded. He might drag from them with a glance. When the chairman at last entered his steps, moderated the minute he saw the man. For the briefest minute his confront flashed with the same pale fear he had worn in the cafe prior that day. But he rapidly smoothed it over, driving an open grin that did not reach his eyes. He took the arrange and cleared his throat. The sound reverberated unnaturally uproarious in the quieted hall. "We are here." He started to talk about a matter of. He faltered, his eyes dashing toward the front push, sometime recently snapping back. To the crowd, of significance to us all, he wrapped up in spite of the fact that his voice needed the conviction it once carried. The townsfolk observed him, but they too kept one eye on the stranger. He did not interrupt. He did not fidget. He basically sat there, his blackout grin never blurring, as if he had as of now listened everything the leader was around to say, and maybe more than that. Perhaps he knew how this assembly would end. Some in the back push whispered among themselves, how did he know to come? Who told him? Did one of us welcome him? The questions tangled in the discuss, but none challenged to talk them out loud. Where he might hear as the leader proceeded his ending discourse, the stranger gradually turned his head to see at the individuals next to him. One by one, his look moved from confront to face. Some looked absent rapidly, imagining to alter their coat or look at the floor. Others may not appear to break absent from his stare. It was not undermining, not transparently. However, it carried a weight that made the chest feel tight and the mouth dry at one point. His eyes bolted with Mrs. Whitaker in the moment row. She froze. Her knuckles brightened on the handle of her cane. The minute extended so long it appeared as if the rest of the lobby had blurred absent, clearing out as it were the two of them in that contract space between look and thought. Then, without a word, the stranger looked back toward the organize as if the trade had never happened. The chairman wrapped up his discourse without making any clear decision. He murmured something, almost shaping a little bunch to talk with the man privately. But the thought fell level the minute everybody realized he was sitting right there listening. The pressure in the room had developed as well, thick to cut through. When the assembly finished, the townsfolk recorded out more gradually than they had come in. They maintained a strategic distance from the stranger's eyes. They talked indeed more unobtrusively than before, and as they cleared out the lobby, they found themselves looking over their shoulders once more. This time not at the purge road, but at the figure still situated in the front row. For he had not moved. He had not risen with the rest of them. He essentially remained there in the purging lobby, still grinning faintly, as in spite of the fact that the entirety thing had gone precisely as he knew it would. When the assembly ought to have been over, and the chairs ought to have been scratching back, and boots ought to have been carrying people into the cool night, the stranger remained seated. No one left. Not at first. Something approximately the way he sat there in the front push kept them secured to their spots as if the worn wooden chairs had developed roots. Then, without standing, he inclined marginally toward the individual on his left. His voice was mou-fair over a mumble, however it carried, with idealized clarity to the one it was implied for. The rest of the lobby may not listen the words, but they might see the effect. The lady solidified as if her spine had turned to iron. Her eyes broadened, her lips trembled, and the blood depleted from her face. She gestured once strongly and turned absent, grasping the edge of her situate as in spite of the fact that she might fall. The stranger gave a little nearly neighborly grin sometime, recently turning his head to the man on his right again. The same moo mumble, the same calm conveyance implied as it were for the ears of that person, and once more the same change. The man flinched, his jaw clenched. He gulped, difficult, and his eyes shot toward the floor, denying to meet anybody else's gaze. One by one, he moved his consideration through the room, not strolling, not raising his voice, only inclining or turning his head sufficient to talk to each individual in turn. Each time the response was distinctive in the subtle elements, but indistinguishable. In its core, faces went pale, hands fixed on coat sleeves or knees, some eyes welled with tears, others contracted in sudden fear or shame. No one talked back. No one inquired him to explain. Even the leader who had attempted to keep up a few similarity of authority sat solidified when his turn came. The stranger's whisper to him was longer. The mayor's mouth jerked as if to answer, but no words came. Instead, He looked down at his hands, which had started to shake. His coffee from prior that day had cleared out a dim recolor down the front of his coat, and for a bizarre minute that appeared to bother him more than it ought to have, by the time the stranger had talked to the fourth or fifth individual the discuss in the corridor had changed. It was heavier now. Thicker people breathed shallowly. No one moved in their seat. No one hacked or rearranged their boots. The as it were sounds were the blackout squeak of the ancient lights influencing and the delicate murmur of the stranger's voice, carrying its private messages from one heart to the next. For a few, the whisper was over in seconds. For others, it waited fair long sufficient to burrow deep. A few individuals appeared to age in the space of those calm words, their shoulders drooping, as if a long time had fair been put upon them. Others sat up straighter, but in a way that proposed pressure, not pride. Whatever he was saying, it was not praise. At one point, he looked to the back push where youthful Daniel Harper sat. Daniel had been attempting to dodge eye contact since the minute he entered the hall. He was, as it were, 20, and had continuously accepted privileged insights were the burden of the old. But when the stranger's eyes found his, Daniel froze. The whisper came not with an incline, but with the stranger basically talking toward him over the lines as if the space between them did not exist. Daniel's mouth parted, his eyes glinted in disbelief. Then his skin turned the wiped-out shade of somebody who has fair recalled something awful and true. He put his head in his hands and did not see up again. One by one, the stranger's consideration found them all. Every business person, each rancher, each child, ancient sufficient to be situated in the hall. The whispers were not boisterous sufficient for neighbors to overhear. It was as if he knew precisely how to put each word, so it landed with culminate accuracy in the ear of its target and no place else. By the time he come to the final individual, a quiet more profound than the one sometime recently had settled over Greyford's gathering. It was not fair. The non-attendance of sound, it was the non-attendance of development, the non-attendance of breath. Even the lights appeared to influence more gradually, as if the discuss itself had developed as well, overwhelming to stir. The stranger sat back at that point and collapsed his hands flawlessly over his hat. His blackout grin remained in spite of the fact that presently there was something more honed in it, something colder. He looked out over the individuals of Greyford, and for a minute it felt as in spite of the fact that he was tallying them, not their faces, not their names, but the weight of what he presently carried from each of them. No one challenged to challenge. Him no one requested to know how he had come by these truths, or why he had chosen this minute to uncover them, because profound down each individual in that room knew that the reply would not be for the group. It would be for them alone, whispered, fair, boisterous, sufficient for their possessed ears, and none of them needed to listen that voice again. At final, the stranger rose. The sound of the chair legs scratching the floor appeared unnaturally boisterous after so much stillness. He set his cap on his head and gave a considerate gesture to no one in particular. Then he strolled gradually toward the door, not hurried, not lingering, simply moving as if his reason in that lobby was wrapped up and continuously had been. The entryway opened with a long, moderate squeak and closed behind him with a gloomy finality. For a long minute, no one moved. Then at final, one chair squeaked at that point. Another, boots shifted, hands unclenched. But the room did not fill with voices the way it might after an conventional meeting. Instead, the individuals of Greyford cleared out in hush, each one carrying something modern and overwhelming that they had not brought with them. And exterior someplace in the dull, the stranger was, as of now, strolling absent, toward a put, as it were. Sheriff Danvers thumped on the entryway of the upstairs room at the Greyford Inn. The corridor was calm, but for the swoon squeak of the ancient sheets beneath his boots. It was early morning, and the discus held that bizarre stillness that comes fair. Sometime recently a storm, in spite of the fact that no clouds had been in the sky when he cleared out his office. He had told himself the visit was scheduled, that it was his obligation to meet any stranger in town who had blended so much inconvenience in such small time. But as he raised his hand to thump a moment time, he found he did not need to. The entryway opened. Sometime recently he could. The stranger stood there wearing the same coat from the night time recently, and that same swoon grin that made individuals feel like they were as of now being measured, weighed, and found wanting. He did not inquire why the sheriff had come. Instead, without a word, he into the interior stash of his coat and drew out something little and flat. It was an ancient photograph. The edges were frayed and the dark and white picture had blurred to a delicate gray, but the minute it came into the sheriff's locate, his breath caught in his throat. It was not the kind of photo a man anticipates to see, given to him by somebody he had never met sometime recently. 2 days ago. It was from a time Sheriff Danvers had worked difficult to bury deep a time, when he had been more youthful, more out of control, and able of botches that still woke him in the center of the night. His hand come to for the photo without thinking. The stranger's eyes did not take off his confront as he passed it into the sheriff's grasp. Danvers' fingers scarcely brushed. The paper sometime recently, the shaking began. It was not a small tremor. It was the profound, wild shiver of a man who has fair seen confirmation of a thing he had supplicated no one might ever prove. The photo slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor landing confront up on the scraped wood. Danvers gazed at it without bowing to choose it up. The picture appeared a more youthful form of himself, standing close to a man no one in Greyford ever talked almost anymore. The man in the picture had gone lost a long time ago. No body had ever been found. The sheriff had told himself that time had eradicated suspicion, but the stranger's nearness here presently with that photo in hand felt like a scoop burrowing through a long time and striking, something buried but not gone. The stranger squatted gradually and lifted the photo between cautious fingers as if it were a sacrosanct object. He did not hand it back to the sheriff this time. Instead, he looked at it briefly, and at that point at Danvers. His grin was the same, but his eyes appeared nearly pitiful in a way that made the sheriff's chest fix, indeed more than fear had. "You have been carrying this weight for as well. Long," the stranger said delicately, and in spite of the fact that the words were basic, they landed with the drive of a hammer in a quiet courtroom. Danvers opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat felt dry as dust. He may not see absent from the stranger's confront. However, each portion of him needed to. The stranger slipped the photo back into his coat. Then, without another word, he ventured aside, clearing out the entryway open as if to welcome the sheriff in. Danvers hesitated, somewhere profound interior. A voice told him that venturing into that room would cruel crossing a line he seemed never uncross. But the stillness behind the stranger was overwhelming, and in that minute it appeared less demanding to enter than to turn away. The room noticed faintly of ancient paper and something more honed that reminded him of metal cleared out in the rain. The window ornaments were drawn in spite of the fact that a lean strip of sunshine cut over the bed where the texture did not very meet. On the work area sat a stack of more photos bound with a strip of fraying twine. Danvers did not have. To open them to know that a few of them would hold faces he recognized, and others he wished he did not. The stranger closed the entryway unobtrusively, and the sound appeared to seal the discuss in the room, making it thicker. He strolled to the work area and rested his hand on the photographs. "Some truths do not like to be covered up," he said. "They hold up, they observe, they discover their way back." Danvers needed to talk, to request to know how the man had come by such things, but his tongue felt heavy. Instead, he took a step in reverse toward the entryway, his heart beating in his ears. The stranger did not take after, but his voice taken after in step moo and steady. "Before the week is over, you will see him again," Danvers solidified with his hand. "On the doorknob, him again. The man from the photograph. The man who was gone." He cleared out the room without another word, without another look, and strolled down the stairs with the photo burned into his intellect. So distinctively, he seemed see it indeed, when he closed his eyes. That night, the individuals of Greyford talked in quieted voices as they passed each other on the dim streets. Some claimed they had seen development behind the moment floor window of the Greyford Hotel, the one that had a place to the stranger. The shades were drawn, but blackout light spilled through fair, sufficient to appear shapes that moved and influenced as if somebody paced the room. Yet at the same time, others swore they had seen the stranger himself strolling. The lanes, his long coat trailing behind him and his shadow extending unnaturally distant beneath the glinting lamps. It made no sense for a man to be in two places at once, but the townsfolk who had seen it held quick to what they had seen, and the certainty in their voices made the discuss feel colder. Those who passed the motel crossed to the distant side of the street, denying to look up at that gleaming window as if perplexed the figure interior might see back and take note them. By midnight, the roads were about purge, and as it were, the swoon sound of boots on cobblestones floated presently, and at that point through the silence. Some said it was the stranger still walking. Others whispered that it was something else, completely something, that had been in that room whereas he was gone and had presently chosen to take after him. The following morning, the discuss in Greyford felt heavier than normal, as if the clouds had dropped lower in spite of the fact that the sky was still cleared. The post office. Mr. Halpern, the receptionist, was sorting the morning mail when he found something wedged between two thick envelopes. It was a single collapsed sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges as if it had been sitting someplace overlooked for years. There was no envelope, no stamp, no return address. It was basically there as if it had set itself on the counter in the center of the night. Mr. Halpern unfurled it gradually, the paper crackling beneath his fingers. Inside were 7 words composed, in an uneven hand that looked nearly carved, or maybe then penned. "You know what you did. The clock is ticking." No title, no signature, no date, just those words alone in the center of the page. A shudder crawled down his spine in spite of the fact that he seemed not clarify why. It was not exceptional for mysterious notes to pass through town talk, frequently made its way into small messages and trivial fights, in some cases finished with dangers composed in clumsy handwriting, but this was different. Letters were sharp, as in spite of the fact that whoever had composed them had squeezed so difficult the write might have torn the paper, and the state itself felt less like a caution and more like a certainty. The clock is ticking. Not it will begin, ticking, but it is as of now, ticking presently in this moment. He turned it over in his hands but found no other marks. The back was clear, the folds fresh and clean. It felt off-base to toss it absent, but off-base to keep it too. He set it on the counter for a minute and ventured into the sorting room at the back to check if there were any lost parcels. When he returned, less than a diminutive afterward, the note was gone. Mr. Halpern froze. The counter was empty. The letters he had been sorting were still there. But the collapsed sheet had vanished totally, as in spite of the fact that it had been culled absent by undetectable fingers. He looked around the little post office, but the front entryway was still bolted, and no one had entered for a long minute. He stood gazing at the purge space where it had been his heart beating as well. Uproariously in the calm room, by mid-morning word had spread. Someone had found another note. This one was lying on the steps of the town library. Same words, same uneven script. You know what you did? The clock is ticking. By 12, there were 3 more, one beneath the plate of new bread cooling exterior. The bakery one wedged into the outline of the mayor's office door, and one tucked flawlessly beneath the windshield. Wiper of the sheriff's truck. No one claimed to know where they came from. No one claimed to know who they were for, but in the corners of the cafe and at the table's exterior, the common store individuals whispered. What if the notes were not for one individual, but for everyone? What if the stranger had cleared out the more awful? What if they had been there long? Sometime recently he arrived, and he was, as it were, here presently since the clock was nearly done. By morning, the discuss in Greyford carried an unusual stillness, as if the entire town was holding its breath. When the pastry kitchen fizzled to open on time, individuals thought small of it at. To begin with, Martha was known to sleep in on event, in spite of the fact that never by more than a few minutes. But as the hour passed and the shades remained drawn, whispers started to stir. Someone thumped on her entryway and got no answer. Another looked through the side window and saw the morning bread mixture sitting untouched on the counter, the flour still scattered over the wooden table, as if she had ventured absent in the center of her work and never returned. By mid-morning, it was clear Martha the dough puncher was gone. No note, no explanation. Her little set of keys still hung on the snare adjacent to the stove, and her cook's garment lay flawlessly collapsed by the sink. It was Sheriff Danvers who had last chosen to inquire the stranger if he had seen her. The man was sitting as continuously at the cafe, closed the window, tasting from a glass that had long gone cold. When the sheriff drawn closer, he did not see up until the shadow of the identification fell over the table. "We are looking for Martha, the bread cook," Sheriff Danvers said. The stranger gestured gradually, as if he had been anticipating the address all along. "I talked to her," he said in that calm, relentless tone that never appeared to rise or fall. The sheriff held up for more, but the man essentially gazed at him with those incoherent eyes. "Where is she?" the sheriff asked. The stranger set down his glass, collapsed his hands, and after a minute said only, "She is where she needs to be." The words advertised no consolation and no explanation. They, as it were, extended the unease that had as of now taken root. In the town, some took it to cruel. She had cleared out by choice. Others dreaded it implied she might not come back indeed if she needed to. By evening, candles burned in about each house in spite of the fact that the lights were still great and the control had not gone out. The light was a consolation against the dull corners, and the feeling that somebody concealed might be standing fair past them. In the cafe, the stranger remained at his normal table, and if anybody challenged to meet his, Look, he gave them the faintest imply of a grin, as in spite of the fact that Martha's non-appearance was basically the, to begin with, move in a diversion, as it were, he caught on. The day after Martha vanished, a man arrived in Greyford on the late morning bus. He was ancient with a confront that looked weathered by more than a long time, and hands that shook when he come to for his strolling stick. No one knew his title to begin with, and no one paid him much intellect until he ceased dead in the center of Primary Road. His eyes settled on the stranger sitting at his normal cafe table. The color depleted from his confront, and he turned toward the sheriff who happened to be crossing the street at that moment. "That is not fair. Anybody?" The ancient man said, his voice moo, but sharp sufficient to cut through the evening quiet. "That is Elias Crowe." The title implied nothing to the individual standing adjacent, but the way the sheriff solidified told a diverse story. The ancient man inclined closer, his grasp fixing on the strolling adhere as if the act of talking the title requested strength. "And if he is here, something is coming." The sheriff looked toward the cafe window, where the stranger presently known as Elias Crowe sat superbly still. Their eyes met for the briefest minute, and in spite of the fact that the glass isolated them, the sheriff felt the weight of that look like a hand on his chest. Crowe gave a little moderate gesture, as if affirming the ancient man's words without requiring to talk them. Whispers spread quicker than the evening wind. Some inquired who Elias Crowe was. Others inquired what was coming. But the ancient man denied to say more. His jaw was tight, his eyes restless. He, as it were, murmured that the final time Crowe had been seen was in a mining town distant to the north, and 3 days afterward that town had been gone, wiped from the maps, as if it had never existed at. All by nightfall, the sheriff went to talk with Crowe straightforwardly, but the stranger's table was empty. The coffee glass was still there, the fluid interior still warm. No one had seen him leave, and in spite of the fact that the ancient man looked the roads with the criticalness of somebody dashing a clock, he found no follow of him either. The moon hung moo over Greyford that night, casting the cemetery in a pale light that made the tombstones see like warped teeth sticking from the earth. The wind was still. However, the disgust felt fretful, carrying the swoon fragrance of damp soil and something more seasoned. Something that had been here long some time recently. The town itself, a little bunch of townsfolk moved through the lines of graves, their lights tossing frail circles of gold on the ground. They had come together in whispered understanding prior that evening, choosing that if the sheriff would not act at that point, they would, at the center of their fear and outrage, was the man who had arrived, as it were, days prior, the man the ancient stranger had called Elias Crowe. They found him without looking long. He was as of now there standing among the gravestones with his cap in his hands, as if going to a few burial service. No, one else had been welcomed to. The light caught his confront and appeared no shock at their approach. It was as if he had been anticipating them. No one talked at first. The quiet extended and appeared to press in on them from all sides. Finally, Jacob Marin, the metal forger, took a step forward, his voice harsh with the strength it took to stand here at all. "We need to know who you are and what you need in our town." Crowe tuned in without moving his eyes, calm and settled on Jacob as in spite of the fact that weighing each word. When Jacob wrapped up, Crowe gestured once, gradually at that point, turned his look to the others one by one, and at that point he started to talk, not uproarious, not delicate, but with the exactness of somebody who, as of now, knew the shape of each thought in their heads. "To Lila. Diminishes the needleworker," he said. "You are anxious. The letter you burned in your stove final winter was not the final of it. To Thomas Slope, the merchant. He said you are perplexed, that your brother will come back from the city and tell the truth around the fire. To Jacob Marin he said you are anxious that your hands have as of now taken more than press from the earth. Each word appeared to strip the discuss of warmth. The light trembled as if in understanding with his sentences. Some attempted to deny what he said, their mouths opening as it were to near once more when they saw the way he observed them with eyes that cleared out no room for lies. It was not fair what he said, it was how accurately he said it. He talked as in spite of the fact that these fears were not privileged insights they had kept covered up, but obligations they had been carrying, and he was essentially here to collect when he had wrapped up with the final of them. Crowe looked up toward the moon for a long minute, sometime recently supplanting his cap on his head. What I need is as of now in movement, he said, and you will each play your portion whether you select to or not. Then without another word he ventured past them and strolled down the limit way between the graves. No one followed. No one indeed breathed until he was gone. As they made their way back toward the town, the gather did not talk to one another. Their lights bounced, like little panicked stars in the darkness. Each carried the same overwhelming understanding in their chest. It was not that Crowe had told them what might happen. It was that he had talked out loud the things they, as of now, knew were genuine. And presently, seem never disregard. The night after the assembly in the cemetery, the individuals of Greyford woke to the sound of the fire bell. It clanged through the roads with an unhinged beat that pulled men from their beds and ladies from their chairs. The ancient process at the edge of town was burning its tall outline lit up against the obscurity, like a pyre flames thundered from its windows and licked at the roof pillars that had stood for about a century. The discuss was thick with the fragrance of burning wood and something more honed, something metallic that no one may name townsfolk accumulated at a secure, separate yelling for water and shaping lines to the well. Buckets were passed hand to hand, but the fire appeared to snicker at their exertion, developing higher and more sultry with each heartbeat. The gleam painted their faces in shades of ruddy and gold, whereas the shadows behind them writhed like living things. Then somebody cried out, indicating toward the center of the blaze. For a minute the swarm stilled. Through the moving window ornament of warm and smoke, they saw a figure standing interior, the inferno tall incline unmoving. Some swore they recognized the long coat and the brim of the hat. Some swore it was Elias Crowe. He stood as if the blazes were nothing more than fog around him. No warm touched him, no cold challenged to arrive upon his shoulders. His confront was calm, nearly peaceful, as in spite of the fact that the annihilation unfurling around him was basically the completion of a few calm design. Several spectators wheezed, others ventured back in fear. A few fell to their knees. The fire thundered on and in. Another squint, the figure was gone, gulped not by the smoke but by non-appearance itself. When the roof at long last collapsed and the final of the process gave way, the townsfolk were cleared out, gazing into the charred remains. No body, no follow, no sign that anybody had been interior at all. By first light, whispers had as of now taken hold. Some said Elias Crowe had set the blaze. Others said he had strolled into it to spare something or somebody and had basically vanished afterward. But there were those who claimed that the process had burned since it was implied to, and that Crowe had, as it were, been there to observe the finishing of a story. No one else, however, caught on. By morning, the smoke from the process had blurred to a pale lace floating into the sky. The ruins still murmured where damp, fiery debris met pockets of covered-up embers. Sheriff Danvers moved carefully through the destruction, his boots sinking into the darkened remains of pillars and fragmented boards. Most of the building was gone, nothing cleared out but skeletal outlines of press and the adamant scent of smoke. He nearly turned back, considering there was nothing worth finding, when his foot struck something strong, half buried in the debris. Kneeling, he brushed absent the cinder with the edge of his sleeve and revealed a little metal box. Its surface was distorted and dark from warm, however still intaglio, the pivots scarcely holding. Together, it was heavier than it looked, and when he pried it open with the tip of his cut, the metal gave a blackout moan, as if standing up to his touch inside was a ledger. Its cover was split and seared, but the pages inside had survived, as in spite of the fact that the fire had saved them deliberately. Danvers flipped through to begin with, few, and froze. Each page bore names, dates, and nitty-gritty accounts of things no one was assumed to know, secrets that had a place to the individuals of Greyford, the kind of privileged insights whispered as it were once, if at all, affairs, obligations, double-crossings, crimes, things covered up for decades, and each section was composed in the same exact hand. Long sometime recently Elias Crowe had ever set foot in town, Danvers felt a cold weight settle in his chest as he realized what this meant. These were not notes assembled by a newcomer. They were a record extending back more distant than his possessed lifetime. Some passages bore dates from some time recently his guardians had been born, and however the subtle elements were correct, as in spite of the fact that the author had been shown at each moment, he closed the box rapidly, looking over his bear in spite of the fact that he knew he was alone. The discuss around him appeared to fix as if the charred skeleton of the process were holding its breath. Somehow he knew Elias would come for this. And when he did, the sheriff would have to choose whether to hand it over or stow away it, and trust that Crowe never found out. But indeed, as he thought this, a swoon impression in the cinder caught his eye. A single impression, driving absent from where the box had been buried. The shape was sharp, untouched by the chaos of the fire. And it was the same measure and sole design as the boots Elias Crowe had been wearing when he arrived in Greyford. The evening sun was moo when she found him. The stranger sat on the steps of the ancient church, his coat hung perfectly around him as if the clean of Greyford might not touch him. Children ordinarily kept their remove, but one young lady, no more than 10, a long time, ancient, strolled right up to him with relentless steps and clear eyes. Her dress was worn and her shoes scraped. However, she held herself like somebody who knew fear but did not regard it. Elias Crowe looked at her without speaking. The shadow of the church steeple fell over them both, and for a minute the rest of the road appeared to blur as if it had nothing to do with what was happening here. The young lady told him that she had seen him the night before. She had not told her guardians, and she had not told her companions since she knew they would not accept her. She said she had seen him standing at the corner close. The burned process after the blazes had died, and in the light of the coals, she had seen his eyes turn dark like the night with no stars. To begin with, he said nothing. Then he grinned a moderate, persistent grin that made her feel both secure and caught at the same time. He inquired her what she thought it meant. She said she did not know, but that it had not frightened her. It had, as it were, made her feel cold, as in spite of the fact that the discus around him was made of winter indeed. In the warmth of the fire, Elias inclined forward, resting his hands on his knees. He told her that she was the to begin with individual in a long time, who had looked at him and not run. He told her that seeing is diverse from understanding and that she ought to keep what she had seen bolted interior, since a few truths, as it were, develop more honed when talked aloud. The young lady did not flinch. She inquired if the haziness in his eyes was alive. He chuckled a dry sound like the rub of takes off. On stone, he said it was not lively, but it was more seasoned than she seemed in vision, and it recalled each off-base and each guarantee made and broken in Greyford, and it would be here until its work was done. A wind passed through the road carrying, with it, the swoon toll of the church chime, in spite of the fact that no one had touched the rope. The young lady felt her skin prickle, but she did not step back. Elias Crowe come into his coat and took out a little question wrapped in cloth. Told her to keep it secure until the time came to utilize it. When she inquired what it was for, he, as it were, said that she would know when the town no longer felt like the put she had been born in. She cleared out him at that point, strolling back into the late evening light with the covered-up weight of the cloth in her pocket. And in spite of the fact that she did not see back, she knew without seeing that Elias was still observing her with eyes that might be dim or might be something else completely. The sound came at sunset, sharp and unexpected. The chime in the center of Greyford was ancient, its bronze confront weathered and split, but it had not rung in years. No one had touched the rope, however it swung in the blurring light, and each chime carried distant past the square, as if the entire town had been summoned. By the time the last resound blurred, Elias Crowe stood at the center of the cobblestones. He did not wave his arms or call out, but the individuals came besides floating from side roads and contract rear ways, drawn as in spite of the fact that a tie had been settled between them. And the man in the long coat, children looked from behind their guardian's legs, but most were pulled absent and sent home. Only the developed remained their eyes on him, their steps reluctant but inevitable. The final fragment of sunshine caught the brim of his cap, but his confront remained in shadow. He let the swarm frame a full circle around him. At that point, he started to move. He halted in front of a youthful man who worked at the post office and inclined in. The words he talked were as well moo for anybody else to listen, but the youthful man's head snapped somewhat, and his hands started to shake. A minute afterward, he dropped the envelope he had been carrying and cleared out it in the dirt. Elias turned to Mrs. Linton, the innkeeper. She had served him his to begin with, night in town, with a constrained grin and cautious words. Now her lips trembled as he bowed to speak her, eyes extended and filled with the shiny sea of somebody recalling something they had buried deep. She took a step back as if the ground underneath her had moved, and she might not discover her balance. One after another, he went to each person a business person, who had run his store for 40 years, a instructor, whose voice ordinarily filled a room presently quiet and pale, a rancher who seemed confront storms and wolves, but seemed not meet Elias's look after the whisper come to his ear. The words changed for each, but they landed with the same weight. Every confront in the swarm carried the same expression once he had passed. It was not the sea of an individual hearing news for the to begin with time, but of an individual being reminded of something they, as of now, knew and had battled for a long time to forget. Sheriff Danvers stood close the edge, his jaw tight. He had stood up to Elias some time recently, and thought himself resistant to anything traps this stranger played. Yet when Elias come to him, he talked for as it were a breath or two. Danvers' hand went to the identification on his chest, and at that point dropped away. He did not inquire an address, and he did not see after Elias as the man moved on. The square was still presently but for the measured sound of Elias' boots on the cobblestones. No one moved, no one hacked, no one challenged speak. When he ceased at final, he turned gradually to confront them all. His expression held no brutality, no boasting fair the faintest follow of, something like completion. It was the sea of a man who had been given a list long back and had fair come to the last name. No one inquired how he knew. No one requested confirmation or explanation. The disgust between them was overwhelming sufficient to hold the quiet in place. When Elias turned and started to walk out of the square, not a single individual followed. They, as it were, stood and observed as his figure retreated into the dull lanes until indeed the shape of his coat seemed no longer be seen, yet no one moved. The individuals of Greyford remained in the square as if venturing absent might let the words he had talked capture up to them. Some gazed at the ground, others at the purge space where he had stood. A few closed their eyes as, if trusting the night would eradicate everything that had fair happened, it did not. When at final the swarm started to float separated, they strolled gradually, their heads low. Neighbors who had known each other for decades did not welcome one another. One thumped on a friend's door, houses closed up early that night, lights darkening behind window ornaments, as if the entire town had concurred to cover up from the obscurity that had been named in the square. By morning, Greyford would feel different, the eye. Same lanes would extend between the same buildings, but there would be something colder in the air, something that kept eyes turned away and words unspoken. Because each individual who had stood in the square presently carried a truth they had not, needed and seemed not put down, and in spite of the fact that they would attempt to go on, they all knew the same thing. Elias Crowe had cleared out them with no way back to the way things were. Sometime recently the chime rang. At daybreak the sky over Greyford was pale and still. Mist clung to the lanes as if it were attempting to hold the night in, put for fair. A small longer. Mrs. Linton climbed the limit stairs of the motel, her hands tight around the brass key to room 3. She had not rested a minute since the assembly in the square. Each time she closed her eyes, she listened his voice once more and felt the weight of the words he had whispered. The corridor was calm, but for the squeak of the ancient sheets beneath. Her shoes. She come to the entryway and stopped listening. There was no sound from within, no moving of weight, no breath, no development at all. She slid the key into the bolt and turned it gradually, as in spite of the fact that anxious of what might be holding up on the other side. The entryway opened. The room was empty. The bed was superbly made as if no one had ever lain in it. The cover smoothed the pads, stout and untouched. A fine layer of tidy still clung to the floorboards by the distant divider, and in that tidy there were no marks at all. No scrape from a heel, no path to the entryway, no indicate of somebody clearing out in the night. She ventured interior, her eyes filtering each corner. The little table by the bed was bare. The closet stood, open, but held nothing. The disgust noticed faintly of rain, in spite of the fact that the windows were closed tight. Except one on the wide sill of the east-facing window, something rested in the powerless morning light. It was his hat, the same wide-brimmed, dim-felt cap he had worn since venturing off the bus. It sat impeccably centered, its crown confronting the entryway, as in spite of the fact that it had been set there with care. Mrs. Linton's hands shook as she come to out, but she ceased brief of touching it. The glass behind the cap was cold. She looked down to the road underneath, half anticipating to see impressions in the soggy earth. But there were none. Only the delicate fog twisting against the stones and the black-out sound of the chime. From the church tower, ringing the early hour, she supported absent from the sill and the cap and the open window. It felt off-base to touch anything, wrong to breathe as well. Deeply wrong to be in the room at all. Downstairs, the hotel was still purge of visitors and staff. Outside, Greyford was starting to wake. However, Mrs. Linton knew without address that something had changed. Elias Crowe was gone. But the cap remained like an implicit message. And in spite of the fact that no one said it out loud, each individual who listened the news would know the same thing. He had cleared out without strolling absent. From that day forward, the individuals of Greyford changed in ways untouchables seem never understand. The chatter that once filled the boulevards developed lean and careful. Where neighbors had once welcomed each other with simple warmth, they presently measured each word. No one inquired individual questions, and no one advertised stories around the ancient days. It was as if the past itself had ended up unsafe a minefield they challenged not step into. The cap remained on the windowsill of the Purge hotel room. No one touched it and no one challenged move it. The clean assembled around it but never upon it, as in spite of the fact that, indeed, time itself was cautious in its presence. Mrs. Linton kept the entryway to room 3 bolted, but she carried the key with her all over. Not to ensure the room from others, but maybe to secure others from the room. Children developed up hearing. The story in fragments. Some were told Elias Crowe was a traveler who brought inconvenience wherever he went. Others were told nothing at all. However, they taken note how grown-ups solidified when certain names or dates were mentioned. They learned early that quiet might be more secure than truth. And on certain evenings when the wind turned cold and the clouds squeezed moo over the rooftops, the town would hold its breath. Shutters would be hooked and lights turned low. Those who challenged to tune in claimed they might listen strides in the purge lanes, moderate and ponder, as if somebody were taking their time. A few swore they had listened the delicate, profound voice of Elias Crowe carried in the wind, not yelling, not calling, fair talking, in a tone implied for a single person, a tone that by one means or another come to each ear at once. What he said was never the same. Some listened their possessed names talked in the dark. Others listened a memory they had buried long ago. Some listened, as it were a single sentence. However, it was continuously sufficient to send them back interior and jolt the door. No one in Greyford ever conceded to hearing him. No one ever conceded to talking of it with anybody else. The fear was not fair of Elias Crowe returning, but of what he might as of now know of what he might as of now be saying to somebody else at that exceptionally moment. The long time passed and unused faces arrived in town. They taken note the way Greyford kept its head down and its voice low. They taken note the bolted room at the hotel and the cap that no one touched. But they never squeezed for answers, since in Greyford it did not take long to learn the most vital rule. Do not burrow into the past. Do not talk as well freely. And, when the night develops still and the wind hones around the corners of the houses, do not tune in as well closely. For in that calm, there is a voice that remembers, and it is holding up to remind you of what you trusted was overlooked.